Thomas Bennett had never planned to return to the hills of southern Montana. For 20 years, he had carved a steady career out of consulting in industrial safety systems, working primarily in the oil fields of North Dakota and New Mexico. His life was structured, calculated, and mostly transient. Projects came and went, and he moved with them like a controlled current. No deep attachments, no obligations beyond the professional, and definitely no dreams of rural inheritance or cattle ranching. So, when the call came from a probate lawyer in Billings informing him that he had been named sole beneficiary of his late father's estate, Thomas's reaction was less surprise and more quiet, logical assessment of logistics. His father, Harold Bennett, had died without much ceremony. A stroke in his sleep, no resuscitation attempt. The man had always lived alone, stubborn, isolated with a hard jaw and a tighter fist, running a cattle operation that had declined from a business to a personal ritual. Thomas hadn't spoken to him in nearly 9 years. They'd exchanged a couple of Christmas cards, a terse phone call when Thomas's mother died, but nothing resembling an actual relationship. The inheritance wasn't glamorous. The estate included a modest 22-acre ranch in a place called Dry Creek Basin, bordered on 2 sides by public land and on the third by a half-paved county road that turned to dust in the summer and mud in the spring. It was a 2-bedroom farmhouse built sometime before World War II, with patchy utilities, a separate tool shed, a half-collapsed barn, and fencing that hadn't been repaired since Thomas was in college. But despite the decay, the land had value, especially in recent years. Land developers had been quietly swallowing parcels across the valley, and Thomas had seen enough project schematics in his life to know what came next. Rural revitalization, which meant private airstrips, craft lodges, and gated communities with fancy words like homestead and retreat attached to them. He didn't return for nostalgia. He came for order and to settle something unfinished, not with his father but with the space the man had lived in. After signing the necessary documents, Thomas took a leave from work, rented a heavy-duty pickup, and drove from Casper through the cold gray flatlands into Montana. He arrived mid-morning, just as the sun was slicing through the low fog, and pulled up to the rusted gate of the Bennett property. The lock was missing. The mailbox was hanging open, stuffed with circulars, unpaid water bills, and a yellowed flyer about a community improvement meeting, dated 6 months earlier. The house wasn't in as bad shape as he feared. The structure was sound, the roof had held, and inside, the air was stale but clean. His father had lived sparsely. An old cot, a cracked leather armchair, a table with no chairs, shelves filled with manila folders and hunting magazines. On one wall, there was a dusty framed photo of a much younger Harold standing beside a buck, rifle slung over his shoulder, grinning like he had just outsmarted death. Thomas didn't touch anything that first night. He unpacked in silence, turned on the propane heater, and sat in the armchair until the room warmed, slowly absorbing the silence that had settled over the land like snow. He didn't sleep much. The place didn't feel haunted. It felt paused, like it had been waiting. Over the next few days, he got to work. She left the bags and walked toward it, slowly, almost unwilling to believe her own eyes. There, embedded into the rear portion of her fence, facing a back alley that no one used, was a narrow iron gate. Not new, not rustic. Just there. The goal wasn't to move in permanently, but to stabilize the property, bring it up to code, and decide whether to lease out a part of the land for seasonal grazing. Several ranchers in the area still worked livestock, and Thomas figured the land could pay for its own taxes if nothing else. There was no rush. He had saved enough to take a couple of months off, and despite the rough conditions, he felt oddly focused out here, more than he had in years. But then, on the 6th morning, while sifting through a new pile of forwarded mail, he opened an envelope with no return address, only a bold typed label. Final notice. Property transfer. Confirmed. Inside was a 2-page letter from a legal firm he had never heard of, referencing the parcel number of the ranch and confirming that the property had been legally sold at auction to a private buyer, Links Civic Development, LLC, for $18,000. The letter explained that due to a community enforcement lien issued by the Dry Creek Property Council, the land had been foreclosed and sold as part of a debt satisfaction process. It instructed Thomas to vacate the premises within 30 days. For the first minute, he didn't understand what he was reading. Then, as the language settled in, lien enforcement, non-compliance with the local obligations, no right of appeal without formal objection on file prior to auction. He felt a slow-burning heat rise in his chest. It made no sense. There was no Dry Creek Property Council. He had combed through his father's legal documents, tax records, land surveys, and ownership history. The land had never been encumbered by any governing body beyond the county. No homeowners group, no association, no community board. His father had despised such things. He refused neighborhood watch flyers when they were dropped in the mailbox, never attended county meetings, and made it a point to tell anyone who asked that his land was his and nobody else's. Thomas drove straight to the county clerk's office, 25 minutes down a winding road into the Basin's administrative district. The woman behind the desk, a tired but sharp-eyed clerk named Lien, scanned the parcel number and tilted her head. "It's flagged," she said. "Foreclosure triggered by a lien under Code 14.1, non-compliance with community maintenance standards." When Thomas pressed her for more, she pointed at the bottom of the screen. "Says the lien was filed by a citizen representative on behalf of the Dry Creek Property Council. Signatory name, Karen Little." He wrote the name down in silence. There was no council. There had never been a council. He asked to see the lien document and was handed a single-page form filed 3 months prior, signed in blue ink, listing a post office box as return address, with a notary stamp from a nearby town that no longer even had a bank. The lien amount was listed as $450 for unpaid maintenance dues, accumulated over 5 years, with no itemization. The office had no further information. "It's legal," Elaine said apologetically. "If it's not contested in writing before the auction date, we don't have grounds to intervene." Thomas felt the cold set in his bones more than the Montana wind outside ever could. He left the building quietly, got into the truck and sat with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel hard enough that the leather creaked. He wasn't angry, yet. He wasn't panicking, but he knew the shape of something wrong when he saw it. This wasn't a clerical error or a missed form. This was a tactic. Someone, Karen Little, whoever she was, had fabricated authority, leveraged silence, and manipulated a procedural loophole to seize control of land that didn't belong to her, then funneled it into the hands of a shell buyer. This wasn't accidental. It was a system, and it had just taken aim at him. He didn't go back to the house that night. Instead, he booked a motel room near the county seat, got online, and started making a list. Names, organizations, statute numbers. He didn't call anyone just yet. He needed more. Not emotion, not confrontation. He needed facts. His father had taught him one thing worth remembering. When someone tries to take what's yours, you don't scream, you document. And Thomas Bennett was about to document everything. Thomas woke up in the motel room with a headache forming behind his eyes, the kind that came not from exhaustion but from the mental friction of realizing just how much ground you had to cover and how quickly things could fall apart if you hesitated. He had only been on the ranch for 6 days, and now he was already fighting to prove he even belonged there. The absurdity of it gnawed at him. He wasn't some squatter or drifter. He was the legal heir, the man whose name was printed on the deed, whose father had held that land since the 70s without ever once being told what to do with it. And now someone named Karen Little, a name he had never heard, who had no official title or position, was able to slap a lien on the property through a filing system so lax it didn't even require formal proof of debt. And the worst part? The sale had already been processed, legally binding, completed. He was not fighting a future event. He was clawing at the aftermath. He spent the better part of the morning going through every record he had pulled from the house. Tax documents, insurance slips, correspondence with the county, everything that might hint at the existence of this so-called Dry Creek Property Council. He found nothing. Not one letter, no meeting announcements, no receipts, no mention of dues. The address listed for Karen Little led to a private P.O. box in a town called Alder Springs, 30 miles west and even smaller than Dry Creek, a former mining town turned retirement stop. Alder Springs barely had a functioning gas station, let alone a community governance structure. Still, Thomas drove out there. He needed eyes on whatever this was. Alder Springs Post Office was a squat brick building with a single clerk and a dusty floor. When Thomas asked about the P.O. box, the clerk narrowed his eyes and said flatly that he couldn't release customer information. Thomas didn't argue. He stepped outside, got back in his truck, and parked across the street for 2 hours, watching. Eventually, a silver Subaru Outback pulled up, and a woman in her 60s stepped out. Thin, well-groomed, wearing a puffer vest and sunglasses despite the overcast weather. She walked with the kind of entitlement that came from years of being listened to without question. She retrieved a bundle of envelopes from the box and drove off without looking twice. Thomas followed her, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. If she was the architect of this scam, he needed to know what he was up against. She didn't go far. Her house was nestled on a small slope about 10 minutes outside town. A clean, modular structure with a wide porch and a solar panel array facing the field. An American flag flapped lazily on a short pole. No signs, no banners. Just another rural property. Thomas memorized the address, took a quick photo of her license plate, and left. He wasn't about to confront her. Not yet. Not without backup. Instead, he went back to the county office and demanded a certified copy of every filing related to parcel 208B17, the legal ID of his father's land. The clerk gave him a folder with 5 documents: the lien notice, the notice of default, the auction certification, the transfer deed, and the summary of sale. All dated within the last 4 months, all referencing the same complainant, Karen Little, acting as resident representative. The transfer deed was the most infuriating part. It stated in cold, bureaucratic language that the property had been sold at public auction in accordance with Chapter 14, Title 9, Dry Creek Regional Maintenance Authority. The buyer, Link Civic Development LLC, was a Delaware-based holding company with no website, no employee listings, and no public-facing office. Just a registered agent and a mail forwarding service. The sale price, $18,000 flat. No contest, no competing bids. Property transferred as is. Thomas called the number listed for Link's Civic Development. It rang to voicemail. He didn't bother leaving a message. He needed help. Real help. That afternoon, he drove into Billings and walked into the offices of Moran and Sutterfield, a small but respected legal firm with a reputation for handling rural property disputes and development pushback. He met with Clarissa Weems, a real estate attorney in her early 40s with a sharp mind and no patience for manipulation. She listened carefully as he laid out what had happened, asking pointed questions, taking notes without interrupting. When he handed her the documents, she flipped through them with a look that hardened the longer she read. "This is bullshit," she said plainly after 10 minutes. "Pardon my language, But this is procedural abuse dressed up as compliance. That regional authority doesn't exist. Not legally. The clerk should never have processed this lien without verifying the entity's registration status. And the sale? That was fast-tracked through a loophole that shouldn't apply to individual landholders unless they signed a participation agreement. "My father didn't sign anything," Thomas said. He hated groups. "Then we fight," Clarissa replied. "We file a challenge in district court to halt the transfer and demand a full audit of the lien's legitimacy. But I'll warn you, this isn't a clean reversal. The sale's been recorded. We're not just arguing a legal procedure. We're arguing bad faith. That takes time." "I don't have much," Thomas said. "They want me out in 25 days. I'll get us a temporary injunction. It won't undo anything, but it'll freeze the status quo. That gives us leverage." Thomas nodded. It was more than he'd had this morning. He left the office with a short list of tasks: deed history retrieval, parcel survey confirmation, affidavits of non-involvement from neighboring landowners. Clarissa would handle the legal assault. His job was to gather supporting fire. Back at the ranch, he found the first sign that things were already escalating. Someone had posted a laminated sign on the gate. "Property pending transfer. Do not enter without authorization." It hadn't been there yesterday. No one had left a note. No signature. Just the bold red print, plastic-coated, zip-tied to the fence. He tore it down and tossed it in the truck bed. An hour later, as he was rechecking the exterior cameras he'd installed 2 days prior, he spotted tire tracks running across the eastern perimeter. 2 sets of all-terrain treads, deep and fresh. Someone had driven up, possibly circled the barn and left again. No attempt at concealment. No damage yet. But it was a message. This wasn't over paperwork anymore. Someone was testing his ground. Pushing. Seeing how he'd respond. He knew the tactic. In the oil fields, rival subcontractors did it all the time. Encroaching a few feet past a line. Parking equipment on the wrong side of a fence. Pressuring by physical presence rather than legal claim. You didn't retaliate. You documented. You escalated through systems they underestimated. Thomas set up infrared motion alerts along the rear tree line. He updated Clarissa with the new sign and tire track photos, and by midnight he had a folder on his laptop labeled Encroachment, Phase 1. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't shocked. He was engaged. Focused. Whoever thought they could run this scam in silence had made the wrong assumption. They thought no one would notice. They thought the owner wouldn't fight. But Thomas had nothing tying him elsewhere. No wife, no children, no job he couldn't replace. He had the time, the skill, and now the motive. He would fight them. Not with slogans or outrage, not with signs and rants, but with methodical precision, legal pressure, and the kind of cold persistence that outlasted greed. And if that failed, if the system remained bent and deaf, he would find another way. Because the land might not mean everything to him emotionally, but what it represented, integrity, legacy, autonomy, meant more than whoever Karen Little thought she was. Thomas didn't expect anyone to knock. The ranch was a half-mile off the road, and the gates had been chained since he returned. But late Wednesday afternoon, as he finished reattaching a section of fencing near the west pasture, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel and saw a dark green Ford Explorer pull up the drive like it owned the place. No one had called ahead. No one had a reason to be here. He wiped his hands on his jeans, picked up the crowbar he had been using, and walked slowly toward the front of the property. The SUV parked by the porch, and the door opened with the practiced ease of someone who wasn't making a social call. A tall man stepped out, lean, mid-40s in khakis and a fleece vest with a clipboard in hand. Behind him, the passenger side opened and out stepped Karen Little. She didn't look surprised to see Thomas. In fact, she smiled, wide and rehearsed like she was welcoming a new member to a club. "Mr. Bennett," she said smoothly, stepping forward without offering her hand. "I'm glad to catch you here. We were hoping to do a brief site review for pre-transition documentation." Thomas didn't respond at first. He took them both in, eyes narrowing slightly. The man with her wasn't law enforcement, wasn't a surveyor. His clipboard had no insignia, just printed sheets and a yellow pen. Karen looked exactly as he remembered her. Tight haircut, polished nails, that suburban cheerfulness applied like a veneer. He kept his voice level. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Karen laughed lightly, like he'd said something adorably naive. "Oh, but that's where you're mistaken. This parcel is in the process of lawful transition, as per Title IX stipulations. We're not here to cause trouble, just to assess structure status before formal transfer. It's all routine." The man nodded, expression blank. Thomas didn't move. "You want to assess something. Bring a court order. Otherwise, get off my land." The pause stretched. Karen's smile faded just a hair, replaced by the tight jaw of someone used to being obeyed. "Mr. Bennett," she said, voice a notch cooler, "I understand this is a difficult time, but resisting a formal transition could expose you to liability. I'm offering you a chance to cooperate, quietly, without additional documentation burdens." Thomas took a single step closer. "You can take your burdens, your forms, and your fictional counsel and drive back the way you came. You've got 10 seconds. They didn't argue. Karen looked at her companion, who gave a quick, terse nod. They turned without another word, got into the Explorer, and left, the tires skidding slightly as they hit the decline of the gravel slope. Thomas watched them until the car disappeared from view. Then he turned back toward the house, rechecked the cameras, and saved the footage to a separate drive. That night, Clarissa filed for a protective injunction and flagged the encounter in their pending civil action. But Thomas knew it was a warning, not a confrontation. They hadn't come to win. They had come to measure his response. The next 2 days passed in tense quiet. Thomas kept working, repairing the barn supports, replacing broken fencing, inspecting the old water tank, and while everything remained still on the surface, he could feel the weight of watching eyes. Friday morning, he found a letter taped to his gate. No envelope, no postage, just a single sheet with a typed paragraph that read, "You are in violation of the interim occupancy clause. Cease unauthorized modifications immediately or face legal escalation. Further action may include forced removal." It wasn't signed. No legal seal, no identifying mark, just more implied threat riding on the back of presumed power. He scanned the letter, added it to his documentation, and drove into town. This time, he didn't go to the courthouse. He went to a diner, sat at the counter, started asking questions, quietly, to the waitress, to the mechanic next door, to the man who stocked shelves at the hardware store. He asked about Karen Little, about any property council meetings, about Link's civic development. Most people shrugged. A few looked uneasy. One man, a retired electrician named Harris, leaned in and muttered, "We used to have a planning committee, years ago. Just locals trying to fix the potholes. But Karen took over a couple of years back. Now she runs it like some damn homeowners regime, but no one voted for her. She just sends letters." Thomas nodded, asked if any of the other residents had lost property. Harris hesitated. Then he said, "There's a family down the ridge, Gales, lost their back acreage last year, supposedly unpaid dues, but no one ever saw a bill." That night, Thomas drove out to the Gales' property. It wasn't far. 1.5 miles east, past a cattle gate and a dilapidated sign half swallowed by the brush. The Gales were home, older couple, wary but not hostile. When Thomas explained why he was there, they exchanged a long look and then let him in. What they told him wasn't a story, it was a pattern. Same names, same timeline. Karen filed a lien under an obscure enforcement code, claimed the family had missed annual maintenance fees, despite no history of such fees ever being levied. They protested, went to the county, hired a lawyer. But before their petition was heard, the land was auctioned. Buyer, Lynx Civic Development. A corporate vehicle with no local presence and no apparent end user. Thomas returned home that night not just suspicious but convinced. This wasn't about one lien. This was a pipeline. Land was being peeled off from under families using a fake council, pushed through a compliant filing system, and vacuumed up by a holding company that operated in legal fog. It was organized. And it was moving fast. The next escalation came without warning. Saturday morning, Thomas heard the sound of metal clanging outside. He rushed out and saw a utility crew in reflective vests kneeling by his eastern fence line. They were driving a small stake into the ground, attaching a plastic flag with the letters UTX, pre-assessment. He approached, demanding identification. They showed generic contractor badges, said they'd been hired for easement surveying on behalf of regional development. No permit, no notice. He called Clarissa immediately. She fired off a cease and desist email and prepared an emergency filing. Meanwhile, Thomas confronted the crew directly. Calmly, but firmly, he stated the property was under legal dispute, that no authorized work was permitted without a court order, and that all access was being recorded. The foreman didn't argue. They packed up and left, leaving the flags behind. Thomas tore them down within the hour. By now he knew what was happening. They were testing boundaries, not physical, but psychological. Each visit, each letter, each stake in the ground was a way to chip at his resistance, to wear him down, to turn the land into a battleground of nerve and endurance. But what they hadn't factored in was that Thomas had lived years on oil rigs where men worked with open wounds, where contracts dissolved overnight, where corporations tried to squeeze every drop of sweat out of your body before discarding you. He knew how to endure. He didn't need revenge. He needed control, and he was reclaiming it inch by inch. He began reinforcing the perimeter, not with weapons or traps, but with evidence. Camera angles updated, cloud backups synced. He drew up a full map of the land and marked every irregular incursion. He placed high-visibility signs warning of pending legal action. And then he made his boldest move yet. He scheduled a press meeting. Not for the media, for the locals. He posted a flyer in town. Dry Creek Landowners Meeting. Independent Review of Property Rights. Tuesday 6 p.m., VFW Hall. No one knew what he was planning. Not even Clarissa. But Thomas had a new strategy. If the system had been quietly rigged against people like him, it was time to drag it into the daylight. Not with outrage, but with records, with facts, with other victims ready to speak. He wasn't going to be their next signature. He was going to be their problem. The VFW hall in Dry Creek hadn't seen a full room in years. Its warped hardwood floors, faded American Legion plaques, and dusty vending machines stood as a time capsule from another decade. But that Tuesday evening, the parking lot filled before sunset. Trucks lined the gravel shoulder. Older men in denim jackets, couples in work boots, women with notebooks and guarded expressions, all of them drawn by a quiet, accumulating frustration that had finally found a name. Thomas stood off to the side near the folding chairs, arms crossed, letting the room settle before stepping forward. There was no microphone, just a short wooden table and a whiteboard someone had wheeled in from the local school. He didn't start with accusations. He didn't start with speeches. He simply asked, "Who here has received a lien notice from a group calling itself the Dry Creek Property Council?" 7 hands went up. Then 5 more. People looked at each other, murmured, some with surprise, some with recognition. A few older ranchers nodded silently like they had been waiting for someone else to admit it first. Thomas let the moment stretch, then unrolled a printed timeline, taped it to the wall, and began explaining. Not emotionally, not rhetorically. Just facts. Dates of filings, copies of liens, names of the complainant, sales records tied to Link Civic Development, the legal mechanism being exploited, Title 9, Chapter 14, invoked as a justification for seizure. Most people had never read that section of the municipal code. They didn't know it allowed for summary auction after 90 days of unresolved debt if the lien was filed under an authorized regional entity. What no one had noticed, until now, was that Karen Little had created that entity out of thin air, bypassing public registration by using a loophole that required no board, no members, only a state admission and a P.O. box. She had filed as a resident-led maintenance cooperative and started levying fines without oversight. Clarissa arrived halfway through. She stood quietly in the back, watching as Thomas laid out the legal framework with all the precision of a man who'd worked years in systems that punished mistakes. Then, finally, someone stood up and said, "My back pasture, sold off last winter. I thought it was county tax collection. Paid 2 lawyers. Never got a hearing." Another added, "They tore down our fencing. Said we'd breached regional access codes." The stories came in low voices, hesitant at first, then louder, like valves releasing steam. It wasn't just Thomas. It was happening everywhere, quietly, methodically, deliberately. And Karen had been the constant in every situation. Not as a legal representative, not as a county official, just as a persistent, polite, relentless woman with a binder full of printouts and an unsettling confidence in her right to decide who deserved to own what. By the time the meeting ended, Thomas had collected 9 written statements. Clarissa addressed the room briefly, explaining the legal path forward, a collective filing, an injunction request to freeze all future sales pending investigation, and a demand for a forensic audit of Link's Civic Development's acquisition history. The hall cleared slowly, but the atmosphere had shifted. People weren't just angry, they were alert. And that, more than anything, was dangerous for Karen's game. She had thrived in silence, in the gray margins between understanding and trust. But now her tactics had a name, and names spread. 2 days later, Clarissa called with news. She had traced the notary stamp used on Thomas's lien. The name belonged to a retired clerk in Alder Springs, whose license had expired 2 years prior. The stamp was fraudulent, clean, precise, but unauthorized. It was their first solid proof of intentional misrepresentation, not just negligence. Clarissa didn't celebrate. She simply said, "It's leverage. It won't reverse everything, but it forces them into court, and that gives us time." Time they'd need. Because the next morning, Thomas received an email from an address listed as operationsalinkcivic.com. The message was brief, impersonal. It stated that in light of recent community disruptions, Links was exercising its right to accelerate transition and would be sending contractors to begin preparation for developmental assessment. No date, No details, just a threat framed as notice. He forwarded it to Clarissa, who fired off an immediate legal response, but Thomas knew it meant escalation. They weren't backing down. They were pressing harder, hoping to overwhelm through force of motion. That same afternoon, a white utility van pulled up to the base of the property. No markings, no plates visible. Two men in work uniforms began measuring from the road inward, planting small colored flags along the front edge. Thomas didn't approach them. He simply took photos, logged the time, and waited. An hour later, they left. No confrontation, no acknowledgement. But the message was clear. They were coming. It was around this time that Thomas began sleeping less. Not from fear, from readiness. He kept notes beside his bed, logged every movement on the cameras, checked the fencing at dawn and dusk. He wasn't militarizing the property. He was preparing a record, line by line, to ensure nothing happened without consequence. And yet, beneath the discipline, a question gnawed at him. Who was behind links? Karen was a symptom, not a source. She didn't have the legal muscle or capital to orchestrate this alone. Someone else was benefiting. Someone wanted these lands consolidated, cheap and fast. Then, a break. Clarissa reached out with an update from a corporate investigator she'd hired. Link's Civic Development was a front. Registered in Delaware, yes, but operating under a trust connected to a real estate syndicate based in Arizona. That syndicate had recently filed permits for low-impact lifestyle housing projects in rural Montana. Essentially, luxury retreats disguised as eco-communities. The ranches being acquired weren't for grazing or agriculture. They were being repurposed for upscale developments aimed at out-of-state buyers seeking authentic rural experiences with full concierge services. Thomas felt something settle inside him, a cold, clear understanding of the stakes. His fight wasn't just about a boundary line. It was about resisting a full-scale erasure of land for profit. They were buying silence, converting homes into assets, turning heritage into product. He looked at the map on his wall, marked in red, blue, and black ink now. Each flag, each incursion, each legal filing. He thought of his father, hard and bitter as the land itself, but proud. And he thought of the Gales, of Harris, of the faces from the meeting. This wasn't over. The middle had just begun. The pressure didn't ease. If anything, it multiplied, swelling from a series of scattered legal filings into a coordinated assault on control over land, narrative, and psychological ground. Thomas felt it each morning when he walked the fence lines and found new flags staked into the earth, new survey markers that hadn't been there the night before. They came in silence, without announcement, without explanation, with the cold authority of people who believed themselves already victorious. The flags bore different codes now. Some marked UTX, others were numbered and color-coded with laminated tags. When Thomas contacted the county to report unauthorized land activity, he was met with indifference and confusion. The clerk didn't even know what UTX stood for. And that, more than anything, confirmed it. This was a campaign operating outside formal recognition, weaponizing obscurity as method. Clarissa was working overtime. She'd filed 3 new motions within 10 days. A cease and desist order for trespass, an injunction to halt all construction or inspection work on contested land, and a formal petition to freeze all transactions involving Link's Civic Development in the state of Montana pending an ethics review. But the court system moved slowly, and the land didn't wait. One morning, Thomas woke to the sound of engines. He threw on his boots, grabbed his phone, and sprinted outside. 2 men in high-visibility vests were unloading equipment from a trailer parked just off the main road. They were carrying ground-penetrating radar units. the kind used in geological assessments. He approached quickly, filming as he moved, and demanded to know who had sent them. One of the men, clearly unbothered, handed him a folded piece of paper, a printed work order from Link Civic Development authorizing subsurface analysis for Phase 1 viability. No court seal, no county permit. Just a logo, a digital signature, and a declaration of intent. Thomas didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply informed them that they were trespassing on contested property under active legal dispute, and that every action they took was being recorded and would be submitted as evidence of unlawful entry. The men hesitated. One called a supervisor. 10 minutes later, they packed up and left. But they didn't remove the equipment. They left a tripod-mounted scanner behind, deliberately, like a stake in the ground. A totem. Thomas carried it inside, locked it in the basement, and cataloged every inch of its serial code and manufacturer tag. That week, the mailbox filled with new envelopes, some bearing legal warnings, others official-looking notices claiming he had failed to comply with interim development coordination, a term that appeared nowhere in county or state code. One letter stated that he was now personally liable for impeding progress under cooperative authority directives. Whatever that meant, Clarissa reviewed the language and found it intentionally ambiguous, just enough to suggest liability, just enough to frighten someone into surrendering, but not enough to hold up in court. She was furious. "This isn't just abuse," she told him on the phone. "It's a psychological operation. They're trying to wear you down until you fold out of exhaustion." And Thomas almost admired the design of it. It wasn't brute force. It was erosion. Slow, subtle, persistent. His water pressure dropped. The electricity flickered sporadically, though the bills were paid. The gravel access road was blocked one morning by a fallen tree, clearly cut and rolled into place. No messages, no vandals caught on camera, just another layer of difficulty. The perimeter sensors triggered more frequently at night. Once, at 2:38 a.m., they caught 3 figures in dark clothing walking the eastern ridge. They never stepped onto the property. They just stood at the boundary line, still, facing the house for 12 full minutes before vanishing into the trees. Clarissa began coordinating with a private investigator out of Bozeman, an ex-prosecutor who specialized in land fraud and corporate misappropriation. His name was Malcolm Dunn, and he worked quietly, surgically. Within 2 weeks, he had traced 3 subcontractors tied to Link's Civic Development, who were simultaneously working with a shadow entity called Graviton Real Assets, a syndicate based in Scottsdale, Arizona, with holdings in Colorado, Utah, and now Montana. Graviton's specialty was covert rural acquisition. They didn't buy land, they bought legal control. Liens, easements, tax delinquency rights. Then they passed those to shell companies like Link's, whose job was to enforce those rights through technical compliance. On paper, it looked clean. In practice, it was a predatory algorithm dressed in bureaucracy. Thomas listened to all of this with the focus of a man preparing for siege. He updated his systems, installed hardline backups for all surveillance, contracted a local electrician to run redundancy lines, and began archiving physical records off-site. He made no threats, issued no press releases. He didn't want to escalate emotionally. He wanted to win tactically, and still the pressure mounted. He received a call from a woman claiming to be a liaison from Regional Citizen Oversight, a department that didn't exist in any public directory. She informed him, in polite corporate tones, that his continued resistance had triggered a formal review process. He asked her what legal statute gave her agency jurisdiction over his land. She paused. Then she said, Section 8B, under proactive stabilization measures. He hung up. The next day, he found a new notice on his gate, larger, laminated, bolted to the fence. It declared the area a pending integration zone. and warned that disruption of authorized operations would be met with consequence. Not legal consequence, just consequence. It was the first time they dropped the mask. The language was no longer careful, it was a threat. Then they made their boldest move yet. On the third Thursday of the month, 2 trucks arrived unannounced, hauling gravel and prefab fencing. A crew of 5 men began unloading with startling speed, laying out orange cones and stretching caution tape across the lower pasture. Thomas confronted them immediately. He demanded paperwork, permits, court orders. The foreman, a squat man with an earpiece, told him bluntly, "You're standing in a development zone. If you interfere, we'll have to report you for obstruction." Thomas replied just as coldly, "If you cross that fence, I'll report you for criminal trespass and file for damages." He called Clarissa, who was already in court that morning, and she contacted the sheriff. Within an hour, a deputy arrived. Young, nervous, unsure. He listened to both sides, then radioed his supervisor. Eventually, after nearly 2 tense hours, the crew packed up and left. But they didn't retreat. They parked 2 miles down the road and stayed there, idling, watching. That night, Thomas drove into town, met with Clarissa, and sat down with Malcolm Dunn in a diner booth. Malcolm handed him a manila folder. "We have enough now," he said quietly. "Enough to open a fraud investigation. Enough to force disclosure of Graviton's backers, but it's going to get uglier. They don't need the land. They want the precedent. If they break you, they break 10 more like you without lifting a finger." Thomas understood. This wasn't just personal anymore. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about leverage, about turning a loophole into a highway. And he was the first blockade big enough to slow them down. He went home, turned off the lights, and stood at the window for a long time, watching the tree line. Not afraid, just aware. The rules were gone. The gloves were off, and he wasn't backing down. The hearing wasn't supposed to feel like a war zone, but that's exactly what it was. The courtroom packed with legal representatives, auditors, county officials, and at least a dozen observers from the valley who'd come not because they were invited, but because they wanted to see if anyone could actually stop what was happening. Thomas sat at the table next to Clarissa, his suit stiff, his mind sharp, but calm like the center of a storm. They had spent weeks assembling their case. Timelines, documents, recorded trespasses, false filings, forged stamps, contradictory signatures, and a web of shell companies that made it impossible to determine who, if anyone, was acting in good faith. Link's Civic Development, named as the principal purchaser of the ranch, had submitted a counterbrief asserting full legal compliance and denying knowledge of any misconduct. Their representative was a corporate attorney from Bozeman, wearing a navy suit and a silver tie, confident and aggressive, the kind of man who thrived on intimidating people who didn't understand the law. But Thomas understood enough. And Clarissa, she had made this her battlefield. The judge, an older man with a reputation for conservative interpretations of land law, began the session by reviewing the petition for injunctive relief and the attached claims of procedural fraud. Clarissa moved with surgical precision, beginning not with accusations but with a single uncontested fact. The notary stamp used on the lien was issued by a retired official whose license had expired over 2 years prior. That alone, she argued, invalidated the filing as legally defective and thus rendered the foreclosure void. The defense objected, claiming clerical error, but Clarissa had already anticipated the rebuttal. She followed by presenting a sworn affidavit from the notary in question, who confirmed under oath that he had never notarized any such document, nor had he authorized its continued use. The judge made his first note. A small thing, a slight tilt of the pen, but it was the beginning of momentum. Then she laid out the pattern. 8 properties in the last 14 months, all in the same jurisdiction, all processed under liens initiated by a so-called Dry Creek Property Council, which had no legal registration, no board, no published minutes, and no tax status. Each lien followed the same format, language, and timeline. Each resulted in a foreclosure sale within 90 days. Each property was sold to Link Civic Development, a shell company linked to Graviton Real Assets, which had no operational presence in Montana. Clarissa presented evidence of identical wording across all council notices, suggesting they were generated from a template. She cross-referenced filing timestamps and proved that several notices were recorded outside official clerk hours, indicating possible backdating or coordinated insider access. The defense countered by arguing that the sales had been publicly posted and that landowners had the opportunity to dispute them. But Clarissa pointed out that several of those postings were placed on unmarked boards in administrative annexes not accessible to the public. She showed a photo taken by Thomas of one such board, tucked behind a locked door labeled Equipment Storage, with notices posted on outdated letterhead. The judge asked for clarification, and the defense faltered, stammering about logistical constraints. It wasn't enough. The courtroom was shifting. The mask of due process was slipping, and underneath it was something calculated and ugly. Then came Karen Little. Subpoenaed as a key witness, she had been reluctant to appear until the court threatened contempt. When she walked in, she carried herself like someone still clinging to the illusion of authority. Her blazer neat, her hair immaculate, her expression serene. But her confidence cracked the moment Clarissa began asking questions. Under oath, Karen admitted she had never been elected to any official position. She admitted she had no legal training. When asked who had authorized her to file liens on behalf of the Dry Creek Property Council, she said, "The community asked me to act." Clarissa pressed. Which community members? Provide names. Karen hesitated, named 2 individuals, both of whom had submitted signed statements to the court denying any involvement. The courtroom murmured. The judge silenced the room and told Karen to answer carefully. Her hands shook slightly as she replied, "I believed I was doing the right thing." It wasn't a confession, but it was an unraveling. Then Clarissa presented the final piece. A recorded phone call between Karen and a Graviton coordinator, obtained legally through a cooperating source, where Karen asked for assistance in filing future compliance notices and discussed a bonus structure based on successful transfers. It was coded language, carefully worded, but the implication was unmistakable. Karen wasn't just acting out of misguided civic duty. She was facilitating a land acquisition scheme for financial reward. The defense attempted to dismiss the recording as inadmissible, but the judge ruled it relevant under the scope of fraud inquiry. The courtroom was quiet now, the tension thick. Clarissa rested her case. The judge called a brief recess. Thomas stepped outside, breathing hard but steady. He didn't look at the people in the hall who nodded to him. He didn't shake hands. He stared out the window and waited. When they reconvened, the judge issued a preliminary ruling. The foreclosure on Thomas's property was suspended pending full investigation. All development activity was to cease immediately. Furthermore, the court found sufficient evidence to open a fraud probe into the actions of Link's Civic Development and its affiliates. Graviton's name was now officially part of a public record. Karen Little was referred to the district attorney for possible criminal misrepresentation. It wasn't final. It wasn't victory. But it was a breach in the wall. Afterward, Clarissa sat down next to Thomas and said nothing for a long moment. Then she exhaled and said, "We're still in the storm, but at least now the map has changed." Thomas nodded. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast, but light crept through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel surrounded. He felt seen, and that changed everything. The land was quiet again. Not silent, not dead, but quiet in a way that felt earned, like a storm had passed and left something intact in its wake. Thomas stood at the edge of the east pasture, his boots pressed into damp soil, the morning mist rising in waves from the grass, and for the first time in months there were no new flags, no unfamiliar trucks parked at the road's edge, no anonymous envelopes taped to his gate with veiled threats or legal jargon posing as authority. What remained was the sound of the wind moving through the pines, the occasional cry of a hawk overhead, and the unmistakable presence of a place reclaimed, not just physically but ethically, spiritually, in that unspoken sense of right that exists, even where laws fail. The court hadn't ruled on everything. Graviton's executives had not been indicted, at least not yet. Link's civic development still existed, though their filings had slowed to a trickle. But the ruling had shifted the trajectory. The ranch was safe, for now, and Karen Little had quietly resigned from her position as coordinator of any neighborhood or regional body, after being served formal notice of a civil fraud claim and the possibility of criminal prosecution. No apologies, no admissions, just a vanishing act into the folds of embarrassed retreat. She was still in Alder Springs, according to the investigator, but her mailbox was empty and the Subaru hadn't moved in weeks. Thomas didn't celebrate. He didn't host meetings or speeches or plant flags of victory. He cleared the fields. He rebuilt the tool shed. He replaced the old barbed wire along the back stretch that his father had always meant to fix. He didn't talk to journalists, though a few had reached out once the fraud probe was announced statewide. He wasn't interested in telling his story for entertainment. What had happened wasn't a story, and it wasn't over. It was a warning, and warnings weren't for headlines. They were for the people who lived on the edges, just like him, who knew what it meant to defend something you didn't inherit with words, but with resolve. Clarissa was still working the legal front. The investigation had broadened into 3 other counties, and there were new names involved now. Other shell companies, similar patterns, a mosaic of small-scale theft masked as development. But the map was clearer. The language was changing. Local offices had begun implementing new protocols for verifying community governance filings. Auditors were paying attention. One morning, Thomas received a handwritten letter from the Gales. They thanked him, not with flattery, but with honesty. "We thought we were the last ones standing," it read. "Turns out we were just the first to fall. You reminded us we weren't wrong to care." That letter meant more than the ruling, more than the judge's signature, because it proved that the most dangerous thing the machine could take wasn't property, it was faith in standing your ground. And that faith had been restored, piece by piece, not with a crusade, but with deliberate, tireless presence. He stayed. He resisted. And that resistance gave others permission to do the same. By autumn, the ranch was functional again. The barn roof had been patched. The irrigation channel along the southern edge had been dredged. He even leased part of the pasture to a neighboring rancher who ran a small herd. Nothing large, nothing flashy, but it brought life back to the land. Movement, purpose. The place was no longer in limbo. It was lived in, maintained not by force, but by quiet will. Thomas didn't know what came next. He didn't know if Graviton would come back under another name, or if someone else would try a new tactic in a different valley. But he knew what to watch for now, and more importantly, the system knew he was watching. Sometimes at night, he sat on the porch with a cup of strong coffee and a legal pad, jotting down notes. Not plans, just reflections. He wasn't looking for closure. There was no such thing. Not really. just movement, just motion forward. But there were things worth remembering. The way the courtroom had gone silent when Clarissa played that recording, the way Karen's voice cracked on the stand, the look in the judge's eyes when he realized the law had been used as a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. Those moments mattered. They left a mark, not on paper, but in culture, in memory. And memory was what kept places alive. So, when the frost came early that year, and the ground stiffened, and the trees began to shed their leaves in thick, spiraling drifts, Thomas didn't see the season's end as a threat. He saw it as a reset. A way of saying, we endured. Not because we were stronger, but because we didn't surrender. Because some lines you don't let others cross, no matter how official their language or how polished their lawyers. And that was enough. For now.